Welcome to another episode of the Sfarim Chatter podcast, and welcome back to the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness series here on Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. In this episode of the series, the 9th, as well as the next 3 episodes, the series will move on to discuss the 10 Lost Tribes and the New World, the Americas. Previously, if you've been following along or if you need to catch up, this is something a little new, so it doesn't matter. We've discussed a broad history of the story, as well as the Sambatyon River, the Eldad Hadani, who appears in the 9th century in Kairouan. We discussed David Ruveni, who appears in the 16th century, the Christian legend of Prester John, the Red Jews, and a whole bunch of other things. This part of this series will move on to discuss, as I said, the 10 Lost Tribes in the New World. This episode, as well as the next one, will discuss Antonio de Montezinos, a.k.a. Aharon HaLevi, a former Marrano converso who appears in Amsterdam in the Jewish community, the Spanish-Portuguese community, with stories of the 10 Lost Tribes, or part of them anyways, in South America. This is recorded by Menashe ben Yisrael, Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, in his Esperanza de Israel, the Mikveh Yisrael, or the Hope of Israel, who relays this. And so we will discuss de Montezinos in the next episode, and then move on to discuss Menashe ben Yisrael and what he says in Mikveh Yisrael, as well as another episode on the Hebraic Indian theory, which is kind of this theory that the Native Americans, or the indigenous people of the Americas, the Indians, they were descended of the 10 Lost Tribes. So we'll discuss that. These will be the next few episodes on the series. And just a programming note, so there's still 9 episodes of the 10 Lost Tribes series, including this one, so 8 more after this. But I will, as I've done in the past, do 2 episodes, take a break, or put up an extra one. So there'll be other, here or there, there'll be other things coming. There won't only be this for the next 2 months. The corporate sponsor of this series, as always, is Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler replacements, main sewer lines, snakeouts, camera ink main lines, to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And please tell them you heard them on the podcast, and thank them for their support of the podcast. This is their 3rd series they have sponsored on the podcast. If you would like to sponsor an individual episode in this series, or to sponsor an episode on the podcast in general, you can find the information in the show's notes below, or email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com. If you would just like to support the podcast, you can find that information, links and information in the show's notes below. There's also a Sfarim Chatter Substack, which is like a blog. It's emailed to you. You can subscribe to that. A Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp, admin-only chat, where I post new books and Sfarim, something which I do on Twitter or X, so you can check out the link to that as well. And also, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform. And as always, any feedback, questions, comments, guest suggestions, etc. are always welcome. You can email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or if you're on the WhatsApp chat, you can find my number there and you can message me. So enjoy this episode of the 10 Lost Tribes series. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast, and another episode in the ongoing series, the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness. And on this episode of the podcast in this series, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Ronnie Perelis, who is the Chief Rabbi Dr. Isaac Abraham and Yelena Rachel Alkali Associate Professor of Sephardic Studies at Yeshiva University. And we will be discussing the relacion of Antonio de Montezinos, or Aharon HaLevi, and some Menashe ben Israel as well in this episode. So thank you, Professor Perelis, for joining me once again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan.
So let's start off. How did you become interested in this topic specifically, in the relacion and Montezinos?
Yeah, so I did my graduate work in Spanish and Portuguese literature at New York University, and I was searching for a topic, as one does, as the graduate courses are ending and you're thinking of your thesis. And I had a great fortune that I took a very part-time job at the Rare Book Room at JTS. And at the time, they paid you very little, but they also didn't really supervise you very much, and which allowed me to explore a lot. And the job they gave me was to help catalog some of the Spanish-Portuguese books in the collection there. And it was fascinating what was there. It started opening my eyes to a lot of what they had was from Amsterdam, things which were published in Amsterdam by Sephardic Jews, things which Jews in Amsterdam were interested in from the wider Spanish and Portuguese world. And there was one book in particular that I saw and I said, what is this doing here? This is not a Spanish translation of the Chumash. This is not a book by Menashe ben Israel. What is this? And it was a history of the kings of Hormuz, along with the description of a pilgrimage from India to Rome by Pedro Teixeira. Pedro Teixeira was a Portuguese traveler who wrote this down. And I couldn't find anything Jewish to it. I was curious why it was in the collection at JTS. All the other things had Jewish content, Jewish connections. And I looked it up in the EJ, and I looked it up in Kaiserling's Bibliotheca and all these different other works. And there seemed to be an idea that this traveler, at the end of his life, returned to Judaism. He came from converso stock and lived his life as a Catholic, but then at the end of his life comes to the Netherlands and returns to Judaism. At least that's how it was described. In some entries, he also is the person who discovered the sources of the Amazon. But that wasn't true, because a lot of this wasn't true, because that was a different Pedro Teixeira, it was different years, it didn't add up. Anyways, but this got me thinking and realizing that post 1492, everything that, that's discussed in a lot of your podcasts and some other conversations we've had, that world opens up this transatlantic, really almost global network of trade that conversos and Sephardic Jews, right? So people who are of Jewish origin who converted and lived as Catholics under the Inquisition, and their relatives or very, very distant relatives who were living openly as Jews in places like the Mediterranean or eventually Amsterdam. These people are intimately tied to this larger Atlantic world. They're traveling around. And although history books will mention them, I wanted to know, are there any other sources that let us know about their life? Like, what was it like to live that life? What was it like to travel and trade and go to these new places, especially when you're dealing with people who are going to really to lands which are very, very new to them, experiencing and encountering cultures and people that are radically different than them, experiencing all sorts of new things in terms of nature, in terms of culture. Do they write it down? Do we have any evidence of this besides just the fact that so-and-so got arrested by the Inquisition in Mexico City or Cartagena or Lima? And so that set me on a path, looking for other books like that, things which would be travel literature. Also at the time, in my graduate studies, I was getting more and more interested in colonial Latin American literature. And travel was a buzzword at the time. A lot of people were doing interesting things on travel, mostly modern, more 19th century, early 20th century travel, which was tied into colonialism and post-colonialism and all these interesting features. But so it was on my mind. And so starting with Teixeira's history and account of his travels, which had nothing to do with Judaism directly, it got me thinking of other texts that are marked by transatlantic movement, by the experience of people who were living as crypto Jews in particular. So I was really, I was not interested just for the sake of someone's genetic background. The fact that like their grandfather converted to Catholicism and they're a big traveler, that wasn't interesting to me. With time, I've come to see that the lines between those different categories are very porous, right? Someone in one context, this is something that scholars like Jonathan Israel and many others have shown. In one context, you might be a seemingly pious Catholic, but given different circumstances, different social outcomes, different realities, maybe you'll start practicing Judaism and regret your Catholic life, but then maybe you'll return, right? So this is, this is a phenomenon that, as I learned more and over the years, I've come to appreciate. There's a lot more blurring of those lines. But for me personally, I was looking for someone who was dealing with that double identity. That to me personally at the time was deeply interesting. How you live one way and in the inside something else, and how do you traffic, between that, on top of the experience of what happens to you when you travel, right? Which travel is such a transformative experience for so many people. What's going on with those different types of transformations? All right, so that was the sort of thing, and that led me to a bunch of different texts that I decided to focus on, and Montezinos was one of my beloveds of the time.
Yeah, together with Luis de Carvajal, the younger, right? I think, and that's we discussed in the other episode of we're discussing your book, Narratives from the Sardic Atlantic, Blood and Faith, where one of the things discussed is relacion. We did discuss it a little bit in the other episode, but it's worth going more in depth here on the relacion. So let's talk about Montezinos. Antonio de Montezinos, otherwise known as Aharon HaLevi, is one of these figures, and we'll get to relacion, and a lot of what we know about him is from the relacion. But let's start off just his biography, kind of who was he? He's one of these kind of people you're talking about, kind of between these two worlds. So just what do we know about him? I guess it has to be also from the relacion. Not really don't know much otherwise. But what was kind of his biography before we dive into the actual text?
Yeah, it's a great question. We don't have a lot on him. We have enough to know that he wasn't made up. He wasn't like a phantom. He was a real person. We have the fact that he's arrested by the Inquisition in Cartagena. So Cartagena is a port on the Caribbean Sea in modern-day Colombia. It was the third office of the Inquisition that was established in the Americas, and it was established to deal with the influx of Portuguese merchants who were actually bringing a lot of contraband. They were going through Brazil, and then from Brazil going through Argentina. Jonathan Israel has a great chapter on this in his diasporas within a diaspora. But there was so much of these merchants coming through, and the church was suspect that many of them were heretics, and the government was suspect that many of them were running contraband. So to have another eye, that many of them might have been, suspicious in other ways. After 1640, Portugal separates. It declares independence from Spain. For 60 years, it was under Spanish rule, and after that, you get a new climate of suspicion, deep suspicion, towards Portuguese merchants in the Spanish world. And so he's a person who's he's from Portugal. He's from a town called Villa Flor. That we know this from Menashe. Menashe describes this. He tells us this, and Menashe notes, and many historians have pointed out, that Villa Flor was a place with many, many conversos. It was known as a place of it was a place with a lot of people with Jewish backgrounds, and he comes doing what so many Portuguese merchants did at the time: travel to the Americas, looking to make a dollar, make a peso, make some money. Some people were major importers, exporters, owning big boats, trading in all the different goods of the triangle trade. Unfortunately, also dealing with human traffic of enslaved people. But part of that large global economy. But a lot of them were petty merchants, people who didn't have a lot, people who were taking something from one port, bringing it overland to another, making small sales. And he was one of those. He was not a big wealthy guy. He was a merchant, enough to be of a certain middle class, but he wasn't one of those major importer exporters that we read so much about. And he is arrested he's arrested around 1639 in Cartagena on suspicion of being a Judaizer, right? Of someone who It was a Catholic who was practicing Judaism, and he played it really well. Right, the Inquisition, if they don't have a lot of good evidence against you, and you consistently deny, they'll let you out. And that's what happened. After a while, they realized they didn't have good evidence. They came to believe that maybe he was a different Antonio de Montezinos. In fact, it's not an uncommon name. There are other Antonio de Montezinos. There's a famous priest who's an Antonio de Montezinos. Anyways, so they let him go. But while he's there in prison, he has a series, according to his account, he has a series of strange experiences. And it starts with every morning getting up and saying a series of what anyone who knows the basic order of tefillah would recognize as a weird version of the Shelo Asanis. Right, the blessings you say in the morning, Shelo Asani Goy, Shelo Asani Isha, right? That you didn't make me a Gentile, you didn't make me a woman, you didn't, right? All those negating blessings, thanking God for not making us something else. He produced his own, what I call a kind of colonial Latin American version. Thank you for not making me a heathen, a black person, nor an Indian. Right, and so the first one, the heathen, that's the original. The other two are the racialized hierarchies of the time. Right, blacks were enslaved people in most of Latin America at the time. He's very thankful he's not a slave. He's very thankful he's not an Indian, because although they were free, they were in terrible, plight for the most part. They were oppressed. They were second, third class citizens, depending on where you were and who you were dealing with. And he said that every morning when he would say this blessing, and he'd get to the word Indian, Indio, he would catch himself. And he'd say, wait. And he would be startled, and he'd say, wait, but the Indians are Jews. Now, this is all in his relacion. So maybe I should explain a little bit the relacion a little bit. So relacion is a Spanish word, means report. It's the sort of thing that any colonial official, any military official would write up at the end of a project, at the end of a journey, at the end of a mission, and to show, hey, to my superiors, I want you to know this is what I did, this is why I did it, this is why I was such a good servant to you, and so you should reward me with another commission or something like that. That's basically what the relacion is. We have them for all the different conquistadores, the explorers, and it's used in other places too. So he tells his story after his time in Latin America in front of a group of dignitaries from the Spanish Portuguese community in Amsterdam. And this is then recorded. And we'll get into the intricacies of the text in a minute, but just this is a recorded kind of, he wanted to tell them what happened to him in Latin America and relay a very important message to them. And so he begins the story on the mountains. They're on a mountain crossing. It's a bad storm. The packages fall off the mules, and the Indian porters that he has working for him curse their fate and have this cryptic exchange in the mountains. And he's overhearing it, and he doesn't understand it. And it's only later when he's in prison saying those blessings, and kind of saying, thank God I'm not an Indian, he realized, wait, basically something happens where he remembers what the Indians were saying in the mountains, and he says, wait, they're Jews. That cryptic conversation I didn't understand then, they were saying that they were Jewish. And this is a belief that he has in prison. He's eventually released because they don't have evidence on him. And he vows to God that when he's released, he's going to find those Indians and get to the bottom of it. And that's how the setup of the story goes. And then his journey ensues, and then he goes back to Amsterdam with the message. And but what we know about his life is he's a person who's a typical Portuguese merchant, travels to the Americas like so many other Portuguese merchants, gets caught up in the Inquisition. The fact that he records, that he talks about himself praying in this weird form, indicates that he had some level of Jewish commitment, and yet he was not living in any outward way, certainly as Jewish. And it's only after this experience that he decides to return to Judaism openly. And that's what he does. He goes to Amsterdam, 1644, and after 6 months there, goes to the Dutch colony in Brazil and lives as part of the Jewish community there till his death in 1647. So that's what we know about him. We know very little. The other thing we know is that Menashe ben Israel will tell us that he was trustworthy. He took no money from the community. He refused any money. We have proof that he wasn't on the rolls. And that's all we know. So we don't know a lot, but we know something. And that's like, I just kind of want to put that out there because it's sometimes you have a lot less, sometimes you have a lot more, but we don't have a lot with him. He didn't seem to be married. There's no kids. Oh, the last thing I'll just say about biography is, according to Menashe, he repeated his story on his deathbed in Brazil, but this was before that community was taking records, so we don't have any record. It's only based on what Menashe heard. So that's that. Yeah.
So because a lot of it comes from Menashe and the fantastical elements of the story, as we'll see, we'll pick up, you said already part of it. As you said, some have said or, kind of alleged that it's made up and Menashe just invented this and they were inventing this. But as you're saying, we have enough outside evidence to say, no, he was legit. This was a real guy, a real story.
Well, he's a real guy. The reasons for him to make up the story, he didn't do it for money, but people do a lot of things that aren't for money, right? I mean,
yeah, and I want to say I didn't mean it's a real story that we'll get to the story that is 100% true what he said.
No, I just want to point that out that
yes,
yeah. Okay, maybe we should say what the story is. I don't know.
Okay, let's go there. We're talking to crypto. Listen, what's going on? Okay, so let's get back to relacion. So he gets out of prison. He vows he's going to go back, and he heads back to these Indians to the mountains. What happens? Let's do it because it's a really fantastic tale.
It's a wonderful story, and when it's a very short, it's about 15 pages or so, not even. It's a very short, tight narrative. If you read it in context of other types of New World chronicles and narratives, it reads very, you feel a lot of the similar themes and styles. I mean, the sense of someone encountering something new, something that's different to them, something that's mysterious. That sort of encountering the unknown and dealing with it in words, which is very hard. So you see some of that there. Also the attention to detail and to kind of trying to give you a sense of like where he's going. He gives a lot of, so he goes, the first thing is to find the leader of the group, whose name was Francisco. And he finds him, and they have this kind of interesting game of disclosure where Montezinos wants to say enough to get his attention, to test him, and Francisco, the chief, the Indian, kind of the head Indian porter guy, wants to make sure that he's for real. And he gives him all sorts of tests. He says to him, okay, but tell me who your fathers are. And Montezinos fails because he says Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he doesn't include Israel. So almost like a code. He didn't say the right code to get in, the password. He didn't know the right password. So there's this interesting thing, but to me, most interestingly in that moment is when he realizes that this guy's for real, he says, okay, I'm going to take you to your brothers. But to do that, you have to let go of all the things which make you Spanish, basically. All the things which make you civilized in a pejorative sense. He says, you got to take off your cape, leave behind your sword. You're going to wear these sandals. You're going to come with me. We're going to eat corn and walk the whole way. You're not going to have porters like you had before. There are no mules. There's no nothing. There's just you and me. We're going to go into the jungle, and you have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to strip down, basically, and lose all those trappings. So again, I said earlier that I was very interested in that experience of what does it mean to live a double life, right? And so to me, that moment of disclosure and vulnerability was so powerful in the narrative, where Montezinos has to give up those things if he wants the truth. And I think that the shock of prison and realizing that he probably had a false sense of security, and in that life, right, that come through the role mercantile life. And he goes on this journey, and the journey takes 7 days, and they get there and they approach a river, and Francisco tells him, listen, you're not going to be able to cross. They're not going to let you in, but you will meet your brothers. And then a group of people come on a canoe. They come out of the canoe. They speak with Francisco, and then they surround Montezinos, and they say a version of Shema. The way it's recorded, it's sounds a little bit gnarled, but they say Shema, and they then go on for a series of sessions where they relay certain messages to Montezinos, messages that he's supposed to give back to the Jews of the world. And they disclose that they are the tribe of Reuben, of the lost tribes, right? They are the tribe of Reuben. They came to this land, that they're the tribe of Reuben, and they give them a bunch of messages to give back to the Jews of the world, mostly of a messianic nature, that they shouldn't worry, that everything's going to fall into place, and they're a big part of it. And the signs are being met. The signs, and many of the signs have to do with the fact that the Spanish arrived and that there's this, conquest going on. But Montezinos is still really confused because they don't answer any questions he has. They also don't let him cross over. He wants to see what the kingdom looks like. They don't let him. In fact, he tries jumping into a canoe and is thrown into the water, humiliated and put in his place, so to speak. And it's only on the return journey Francisco tells him the whole story and explains to him what happened. And the version that's given there is basically the Reubenites arrived to the Americas before there was anyone. And later, other groups came. And when the other groups came, they attacked and persecuted the Reubenites. So much so that the Reubenites receded into this mountain kingdom where they were protected by the mountains. And every time groups of new arrivals would come and attack them in their stronghold, they would all be destroyed. So they were very fierce warriors, the Reubenites, but they still had to kind of be receded into this small place. They couldn't go out. And at some point, the leaders of the newcomers said to them, and it's interesting, they use the term mohan, which is the term that in that part of the Andes is a term for kind of leader, indigenous leader. Interesting, like in terms of the terminology. Said that the Mohanes finally admitted their error in persecuting the Reubenites, and they told their people, if you want to be successful, join yourself to them, serve them, be allied with them, protect them. And a small group of these other arrivals, who then become known as the Indians by the Spanish, they set up a system whereby they would come every so often, every few months, to the Reubenites, relay information, that they would protect them, that they had a whole allyship with them, and this is so Francisco and his friends, who were the porters, are part of that, what I call in my book, Hebreo-Indian allies, right? They aren't Hebrews, they're not Reubenites, they didn't convert, but they're allies of the Reubenites, and they form this kind of this alliance. And so at the end of his trip, Montezinos now has these messages from the Reubenites, and he has this very important message to give to the Jews of the world, namely that one of the big signs at the end of days that are coming, right, that the tribes which were dispersed are resurfacing, has been met, and that they are ready to take down the Spanish. They are ready to attack and bring down the tyranny of the Spanish and their colonialism and their cruelty towards the Jews. And just wait, because this is going to happen soon. Very exciting. So this is, and he goes back to Amsterdam, tells the story. And like I said, never tried to make a profit from it, didn't write about it. This was recorded, it was talked about, and it gets picked up because of Christian interest, not Jewish interest, which is interesting. We can talk about that if you want.
So I think there's a lot to discuss over there and unpack in what you're saying. But first of all, as you're saying, it's just the tribe of Reuben, just David Reuben. So he's not saying that it's the 10 lost tribes, all the tribes.
Right. Yeah, he's very specific about Reuben. He says it's Reuben, it's just them. And yeah.
And the other thing that you pointed out, interestingly, is he's not saying, this is for a different episode, perhaps, that, Native Americans, Indians, all over the Americas are the lost tribes. And then we'll get to maybe a little bit here about Menashe ben Israel and Mikveh Yisrael. But he's not saying that, Montezinos. He's saying that they're enclosed behind this river in the mountains. There's the tribe of Reuben. So it's not all of as you said, the Indians are kind of serve them or help them out or whatever. But the Indians themselves, the Native Americans, are not lost tribes. Correct?
Yeah. So this is a really important point, and it gets to the bigger history here. Starting with Columbus calling these people Indians, right? That mistake, or whatever you want to call that erasure of their identity, really, making them something that they're not. From that time onwards, as Europeans started to realize that they are not in India, this is a new country. This is what is known as a new world. These continents were not discussed in the Bible. They're not discussed by Ptolemy, by any of the great Greek scientists. And this was very confusing, challenging to many, many Christians and some Jews. And why isn't this in the Torah, right? Why aren't the Americas talked about in the Torah? I thought there are 3 children of Noah. Everyone's descendant of them. Do we have evidence of these people in that genealogy? And this was a big concern for some people. And one of the solutions was to say that these people came from somewhere else and somewhere that we know. There was a lot of theories that they were Phoenicians. Phoenicians were great travelers. They went past the gates of Apollo and in Gibraltar, and they came here. They were the survivors of Atlantis. All sorts of different theories. One of the most compelling for many people was that they were descendants of the lost tribes. These tribes were sinful. God put them far away because they were so sinful. And it could explain the deep idolatry from the eyes of the Christians, the deep idolatry, almost devil worship of some of the indigenous communities. that they encountered. It also explains certain words that sound like Hebrew words, like, for instance, katzin, Hebrew for officer, sounds a lot like kasike, which word for chief in some Indian indigenous languages. I mean, it's not very compelling to me, right? But at the time, it was very cool. And, people were saying, oh, maybe there's this. Also, some tribes practice Brit Milah. They had circumcision. Certain aspects of Nida seemed to be something they practiced. So they had all these theories that maybe the way these people are here, they're the lost tribes. They were put here, and they were put here for good reason. This is why it's hard to convert them, because they're Jews and they're stiff-necked, right? They're difficult, right? They're all these theories, and a lot of books were written by smart people about this. So that was floating around, and when this story hits Amsterdam, so the Jews are talk about it, but they don't stop what they're doing and say, "Oh my God, the Messiah is coming. Let's get the ships ready. Let's make contact with the Reubenites. Right." You don't do any of that. But a Christian who was there at the time, a radical Christian, his name was John Dury, was living in Amsterdam at the time. Remember the story. He goes back to England, and he meets someone called Thomas Thorogood, who was interested in converting the Indians in North America. And Dury says, oh, there was a story about Jews in South America. So he writes to Menashe. Menashe had a lot of he was friends with a lot of Christian theologians. He was kind of the go-to guy at the time, right? If you were a Christian and you wanted to know about Judaism, you'd go to Menashe. And he says, hey, can you send me the record of that account about the Indians? So he sends it to him. And then Thorogood writes his book, and I'll read the title: Jews in America, or Probabilities that the Americans are of that race, with the removal of some contrary reasonings and earnest desires for effectual endeavors to make them Christian. They were not into being pithy back then. And he writes this book, and Menashe is really upset because they didn't understand the point of Montezinos' account. Montezinos made it very clear, according to Menashe, and I think it's a fair reading. The Reubenites are one group. The majority of the indigenous people around them are not of Jewish origin. Some of them are friends of them, or they're friends, they're allies. They have a certain degree of brotherhood, but they're not Jews. And Menashe said, I need to set the record straight. So very quickly, he wrote this fascinating little book called Mikveh Israel, the Esperanza de Israel, the Hope of Israel, that was all about the dispersal of the Jews around the world, dealt with the lost tribes, that they're not lost, they're just dispersed, and that Jews, no matter where they've gone, all over the world, have always maintained their Judaism, and they're waiting for the Messiah, but not in the Christian way. And he wanted to set the record straight, so he includes the full relacion, the full report, Montezinos, and then writes this fascinating work of, theology, anthropology, ethnography, history, and a lot of politics. There's a whole political element to it. But so yes, exactly. The Montezinos does not argue there. He's not saying that the Aztecs and the Iroquois and the Taínos and everyone, they're all Jews. No, he's saying this specific group, right?
So interestingly, and then you really answered, what happened to Relacion. So Montezinos doesn't publish it. It's kind of this oral text that gets published by Thorogood, right? Thorogood and Dury, and then it ends up being Menashe publishing it after. So interestingly, the language that this was said, and then the language that this was printed in was different. Let's talk about the languages here, because it's important. Things get kind of lost, especially as an oral text. But even more, it's not even an oral text that was written down, because Montezino speaks Spanish, Portuguese. He's not a Duri, Thorogood, or English speakers. It's published in English. Menashe writes this is it in Portuguese or Spanish now? I'm not recalling. And then eventually
Spanish,
gets
yeah.
Spanish, and it's Latin, and then there's an English translation done of Menashe. So talk about the different languages and kind of what happens here.
It's a real mess. It's a real mess. It's part of that, polyglot world that they were part of. Exactly. Montezino seems to give his account in, we presume, either Spanish or Portuguese. We don't have the original, like I said. The version that Menashe sends to Duri is in French. That doesn't exist. We don't know where that is. And Menashe, when he publishes the Esperanza, he has it in Spanish. Okay, the differences between Spanish and Portuguese, not great, but again, we don't have the official version anywhere. So, we're living in Menashe's world here. The text is Menashe's text. Whatever mistakes or corrections were made are made by him, and that's how it exists. And yes, Menashe first writes the book in Spanish. It seems to be quickly translated to Latin, and then the Latin version is the basis of the English translation, which Littman published a very nice version of that English translation by Gerard Nahon and Meshulam, and that version, the intro is very, very important, and the text is a little difficult because it's in 1650s English, based on a Latin version of a Spanish text that it's not very readable. But the notes are very good because of Nahon and Meshulam.
I was going to say I'll link to that, and it like you said, it's by some Moses Wall. I think that they don't know anything about it. Translated.
Yes.
They used kind of this 1652 English. I don't know why they did this, but a lengthy introduction, very long introduction, and then the text, very good notes. But it's this old English. There are Hebrew translations that are done throughout the centuries, as well as Yiddish and Hebrew. I actually also, which I'll link to the Hebrew one from Hebrew Books. There's some of them are there, and you can get it through Amazon, the print on demand, for like $3.99 for those interested. And then I own the copy of Menachem Dorman wrote a book, Menashe ben Yisrael, and he has the Ivrit translation with notes as well. And he has a lengthy bio like of Menashe in the front. So he has Mikveh Yisrael in there, and then in the back he has also he translated into Hebrew also Menashe's letter, whatever, to Cromwell that we'll get to Oliver Cromwell. So he publishes that as well. The book is called Menashe ben Yisrael. It's the Kibbutz Meochad. I don't think it's in print at all. I got it used from somewhere. So there's the various different editions, and so I think that's a good way to segue into how you mentioned this kind of the Christian interest. These were millenarians, and there was a lot of millenarianism and a lot of messianism, and apocalyptic vision things going on at the time in England especially and in Europe, and that's and then Menashe gets caught up in this also. As you mentioned, the Jews don't get caught up in this until Shabtai Tzvi another 20 years later. But at this point, the Christians are all very into this, and then Menashe gets caught up into this, and then he writes this book, and then he goes to England, and then it's this whole thing with Cromwell, get the Jews readmitted to England, because Jews are everywhere in the world, including in the Americas, because of this, right? This is part of Menashe's thing. So I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about Christians and millenarianism and Menashe and Cromwell and how that fits in here.
Just a little bit, you're right. So there's a practical issue that the Jews in Amsterdam face, and I know many of the people you've had on already, my teachers, my friends, who work on Amsterdam, and have talked about this. There's only so much space. Amsterdam's a small town. They have access to a bunch of different cities in the Netherlands, also Hamburg, Danzig a little bit. There's a need for more access to more places for members of their community to live. Eventually, they will, have settlements in the Americas, like Suriname, where many people can go, and in Jamaica and in Curacao. But the community is always looking for new places that Jews could have refuge. And Menashe, knowing a little bit about the messianic attitude or the millenarian attitude of Cromwell and his circle, figured that he could make a good argument, just like you were saying. Now that Jews are everywhere, Jews are now found in finis terra incognita, right? The end of the unknown world. Shouldn't they be readmitted finally to the end of the known world, England? Right? England means the edge of the world, the angle. He played with that. There's a little bit of a nice little wordplay there. And that was part of it. But what he does in the book is go case by case and say to Cromwell, every place that the Jews are admitted and are treated well, they do well for the people. They make those countries rich, they make those countries stable, they make those countries wise. And I'm going to show you. I'll show you here, I'll show you there. And he also along the way wants to show that Jews all over the world, in China and India, all maintain their Judaism. They haven't lost their Judaism. And that's a very Jewish argument here, right? That the Messiah is going to come because Jews are still holding on to their Judaism. And not, in other words, not because they're becoming Christian, right? And so this is part of some larger vision that he's doing. He's kind of using the messianism. I'm not saying that he didn't believe in the messianism. I'm just saying that he understood how it would play with someone like Cromwell, and he uses it to make this argument. In the end, Jews get admitted to England, but after Menashe's death, and it's not exactly clear all the different calculations. That's a whole other story. But this is it's interesting because it's so much a story that gets co-opted on so many levels by so many people all the time. I think when it was first told, it seems like it was, like I said, it didn't really elicit a lot of interest among the Jews, and it's the interest among the Christians that gets them excited, or gets at least Menashe excited. And he writes this book that does so much more. But it's the fact that he keeps the relacion in the book as something separate. It's a great resource for scholars, obviously, today, but I think anyone who's interested in, and again, like trying to get access to what it was like to be in a place you never knew, right? A completely, unknown space. What's that experience like? And there's a very deep ethical heart of the relacion, something that I think is lost in the Mikveh Israel, which is Montezinos, at least I see it this way. He starts his life as a person with privilege, a person with security, who's living his life, and over time he has these knocks that shake up his stability, and he starts to question things. And in that questioning, it opens him up to the humanity of this person who was just his servant, right? The Francisco character. And his relationship with Francisco gets transformed through it. And at the end, the last scene is Francisco and three other of these allies of the Reubenites gathering around Montezinos and telling him, we're all brothers. God made us all. And don't worry, because we're going to be there for you. So there's this really almost like, that for me is the messianic moment. This kind of like, all these things are going to come together. That message was not the one that I think resonated strongest in the Mikveh Israel. In fact, Menashe works hard to say, no. Most of the Indians, we know they're not like Jews. We're different than them. But that's the play between the text and the commentary, so to speak.
Yeah. So first of all, just a couple things on Menashe. We'll get back to more
Yeah, for sure.
Montezinos. We'll discuss a little Menashe, but Menashe, I'll say for the listeners, there'll be more future
Yes.
episodes in this series discussing more Menashe, more Mikveh Yisrael, which I will already mention goes through. I mean, Menashe really goes through the lost tribes and the 10 where they are and how they got, and if they're in America, how they got there, and he goes through every different opinion. It's just a fascinating, wild text to read. But he does. I will also. I'll link in the notes to Mikveh Yisrael, and like I said, also it's on Hebrew books. You can read it. To His Highness the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland, the humble addresses of Menashe ben Israel, a divine and doctor of physic, on behalf of the Jewish nation. It's what he sends to Cromwell. So you can read it in the Old English because that's how he sent it. That Menashe sent. So, but as you say, Mikveh Yisrael starts off with Montezinos. I mean, he has a separate section. It's Montezinos relacion, and then he launches into his own thing. Now, there's something important is you emphasize that Menashe really kind of stresses the trustworthiness of Montezinos, of Aharon HaLevi. And he says, this guy's the story sounds wild. The 10 lost tribes are in America somewhere, or Ruvain, but they would call them 10 lost tribes. They're somewhere in America. He says, no, this guy is trustworthy. However, you did say also that other than Menashe, really, this kind of resonated with the Christian world. It didn't really resonate with the Jewish world. This story, as far as we know, is not because did people not believe Montezinos? Is that what Menashe tried? Did he not? Was this story like they're like, oh, this is made up?
I wonder. I really wonder about that. I mean, right? Menashe tells the reader, basically, he's one of us. You can trust him because he's one of us. He says he went through the forced conversions. He's lived under the Inquisition. We know this person. He's one of us. We can trust him. He didn't do anything for financial gain, all those things. And then I guess, then there's the sense of like, look, I can fit it into all these other narratives. I know why they didn't embrace it or think about it too much, kind of really, I don't have a good answer for it. Besides the fact that, I don't know, they were busy making money. They were busy keeping their community going. They were busy it was, Shabtai Tzvi has a whole machine behind him, right? Shabtai Tzvi is not a one-man show. It's a whole thing. He's this persona. Montezinos never tried to be even an Elijah figure, right? He didn't want to be an Eliyahu, an Navi, like proclaiming them. No, he's just giving you information. And it's interesting. I was always fascinated by his decision to not stay in Amsterdam. He goes to Brazil. Did he want to be closer? Did he just prefer the American reality? I don't know, right? Brazil was where people who didn't have a lot of money went, right? That's the other thing. So it could have been just financial. But my dear friend Jonathan Shorish wrote a wonderful, very long, almost like a monograph on the relacion. He does a lot to explain the veracity of it, like what was going on there on the ground in New Granada, in other words, Colombia. He analyzes all sorts of things, and he'll do a better job than I will. I don't want to say it. Trying to contextualize it and trying to see the reality of the story. In other words, if this isn't a complete hallucination or a complete made up story, what was it? But clearly, someone sitting in Amsterdam hears a story. It must have been strange to believe. That said, the discussion about who the Indians were was a live discussion. The idea that there were still many places in the world that were mysteries, that had kingdoms, mythic kingdoms, the kingdom of Prester John and things like that, that still was an idea. And also the belief in a Messiah coming from one of these places is not that far off. Remember David Reuveni, it's about 100 years before, but it's Reuveni, right? He's of the Reubenites. And every once in a while, you'll see instances of people before the Inquisition mentioning the lost tribes coming to rescue them. and even references specifically to Reuben, which is very interesting. And I don't know if that's also like a David Reuveni afterlife. But so that's just a little bit about in other words, you wouldn't have heard it and thought this is completely crazy. It's different. It's maybe out of your horizon, but they were exposed and thought of a lot of different things. Also, the Messianism was pretty across the board. The Spanish Catholics and Portuguese Catholics had their version of Messianism. There was a king, Sebastian, who died in an attack on Morocco, and he became this messianic figure. So you have a lot of different stuff floating around. That's, it's a little strange to us, but back then was floating in the air, right? That could coexist with someone being very rational and very, very of this, down to earth. Yeah.
So that's interesting because, as you say, Montezinos wasn't, Eliyahu, but it wasn't, a Nathan of Gaza by Shabbat Tzvi, so it was behind him. But was there, and he wasn't trying to make a profit off of this, but was there a messianic point though? Was Montezinos did he have a messianic, agenda of some sort pushing this?
Well, I mean, the 12. I think it's 9 things. The 9 points that they tell him are basically things of comfort and preparation. You should prepare for the day. It's happening. It's going to come, and you should be assured that we're here, that we're ready. We're waiting our orders, so to speak, and that and that's why he goes back straight to a Jewish community to tell it, because he feels very obligated to do so, to share that message. So there definitely is. It's interesting that it's not picked up by others, right? That'd be an interesting story. I haven't seen that, at least, right, where other messianic agitators, visionaries, pick up on the story and run with it or use it. The more, in Mormon theology, the lost tribes play a role with the Americas. But you don't see too much being done with that.
Now, getting back to Menashe, just like I said, although we'll leave more of Menashe discussion and Mikveh Yisrael discussion for this different episode. So Menashe comes across this because he's in Amsterdam and he hears Montezinos, right? And he decides, is that, first of all, is that true? That's where he hears this?
Yeah. Menashe was present when he gave this story. He told his story to a group of dignitary, esteemed members of the community. So Menashe was there, according to Menashe. But again, we don't have the record. We don't know. I mean, even if we did have the record would be the record of something oral. We don't have Montezinos, saying, "Oh, this was me," and yeah.
Now, Montezinos and the relacion, is there any, it cannot be corroborated by any outside evidence, meaning, of course, the story can't be, but were there any others coming and saying the same story or the same kind of thing? Or this is like a one-off, this Antonio de Montezinos has this whole relacion?
I mean, it's kind of a one-off. I don't know of any other stories like this. Jonathan Shoresh does deal with some interesting parallel narratives that come from certain indigenous groups, certain runaway slave groups that are very, very compelling and interesting. And I'll let him do that. But I think that sort of thing, I like I said, I don't see too much of that, and it's interesting to me that people didn't pick up on it later. They didn't say, "Oh, sometimes you have these copycats, right? Where people are like, "Oh yeah, I met them," or indigenous groups saying that they are that, or you don't see that happening very much here. There are parts of Colombia where people with converso origins are, have a self-identity that way. but they don't link themselves back to him. Yeah.
So I want to end off really with a quote from Cecil Roth. I think you discussed this as kind of a famous quote, and it's kind of like captures the whole story here. And I want to get what's your opinion on this thing? Cecil Roth said that Montezinos and relacion were the ravings of a wild-eyed Marano. Kind of a really pretty derogatory thing to come out and kind of throw Montezinos and this whole story under the bus, basically.
Yeah, well, that says more about Cecil Roth and his issues and what he wanted to, the sort of dignified Judaism he wanted to present, right? Which, thank God for Cecil Roth. He did an amazing job. But why was he interested in Jews in Italy and Jews in Amsterdam? Because they were sophisticated, cosmopolitan, people who embraced science and all this. He wasn't impressed with the fact that they went, crazy for Shabtai Tzvi, or he's not going to be talking about the importance of Kabbalah in the community and things like that. So that's Cecil Roth. It makes sense to me that that's what he would do. Also, the other piece is he's again, I come to this from literary studies. So I appreciate it as a literary text. I'm not looking at it. I care about the history tremendously, about the context, about the ideas that were floating around, about the realities. But the text itself, is ultimately a literary construct that reflects so much about the time period. But it's not a snapshot. It's not a video. It's not a security camera that we can know exactly what happened there. It's a subjective narrative of one man's experience, and so much of it is him contending with the difficulty of using words to describe this experience, which was kind of which was a complex, seemingly profound experience for him. So yeah, and Cecil Roth, that's not what he's interested in. He's doing something else. But I do like that. I like it because it's a great foil. So. Yeah.
So I think I said that was the final question, but I'm going to ask you one more about Montezinos.
Sure.
So kind of what's the afterlife of the relacion? I mean, do we see throughout the centuries? Do we see others picking up? Besides from Menashe, do they find him throughout Menashe? Do we see others engaging with Montezinos and this tale at all, in the Jewish world, especially?
You see more engagement with the Mikveh Israel than with the relacion is just seen as like an appendix, which it was. It was placed there almost like that, but there's a lot more interest in that and than with the relacion as is. That's I see, but I hope there'll be more, because I think I think on its own it's a fascinating text. It shows the limitations of what we can know about the time period, of the people and all that, but it also gives us great access. And I would just say, if you compare it again to a lot of the other accounts, the Spanish accounts, Portuguese accounts of the explorers and the conquistadores, they're also very problematic. They're often recorded by someone else. The original was lost. We only have the notes. It's the nature of the beast a little bit. We rarely have a clean manuscript of something that we know, oh, this is it. And even then, right, people tell their stories, and they can tell their story in a different way in 5 years, right, from when they first did it. But yeah, there's not. I personally, I'd be curious. I'm surprised there aren't more novels. It'd be a great novel. There might be that I'm not aware of. I tend not to read historical fiction about my period. I can't get lost in it, so I don't read it. But yeah.
Yeah, there's historical fiction. I mentioned the podcast number. It's our Journey to the End of the Earth about Menashe in Israel and getting the Jews readmitted. I don't remember if Montezinos is mentioned in there. I don't think, definitely it's not the emphasis in that book. But so I'll link to Duri and Thorogood. I'm sure we could find somehow the old books and Mikveh Yisrael in Hebrew, Mikveh Yisrael, Mikveh Israel, the Hebrew, the Hebrew one, and then the English one from Littman. as well. I'll link your book that I mentioned because you discussed the relacion in there. But what other, what suggested reading can you suggest for those interested in relacion and this topic?
Yeah. So, if you want to deal with the question of lost tribes and origins, Richard Popkin has written some really important older stuff on that, because there were some really interesting theories going around at the time of the pre-Adamites. There was a theory that there were people before Adam, and that's maybe the Indians, all things like that. It's bizarre, but it's interesting, and interesting Jewish connections there. Jonathan Shorish's article is really chapter is really important, really essential on this. Mishulan and Nahon's edition. The intro is fabulous, and the notes are very good. I know I'm missing. I'll have to send some more things here, and I apologize to the people who I've learned from, who deal with the book, that I may be blanking on it.
Well, like I said, there's your book, and you have articles on this. I can find them on your academia page.
Yes.
I can put them up as well. And yeah, if you find anything else after we finish this recording, you send it to me before this goes live. I will add those as well to the notes that the listeners can check out.
And I'd say those people who read Spanish, the Spanish version of the Esperanza is beautiful. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating Spanish. It gives you a good sense of the way that the Jews at the time in Amsterdam were writing and so fluent. It's not Ladino, it is Spanish. It's Spanish at the time, and which is really interesting. A little, something that got me started with this project, really not directly, is a book. It's an old book. There's been better books. Is a book by Andre Neher on David Gans. And it's an old book. I bought it at the Strand when I was a college student for like $2. And it has some fascinating things. But I know other people have worked on David Gans more recently, and people dealing with early questions of geography and things like that. Also, there's a fabulous dissertation from Hebrew University by Limor Mintz-Naor. It's not in a book, but she's written some articles, some in English. And she wrote all about Jewish attitudes towards the discovery. And it's excellent. It's very, very good. I mean, the research in it is just beautiful, and she's a good writer and in Hebrew, but that book is read by Limor is very, very good. And so that's, but I'm sure I'll come up with more. I'm sure more will come up as soon as we say goodbye.
Okay, terrific. So I'll link to a bunch of that in the notes, and hopefully listeners learned about a good bit about Montezinos and his relacion. They should definitely read it. If you haven't read it, highly recommend for everyone to read it. And and then Menashe, we discussed a little bit, but for listeners, stay tuned for more discussion on Menashe and Mikveh Yisrael and lost tribes. And thank you, Professor Perelis, for joining me once again.
Pleasure. Really my pleasure.